Hi, I'm Sarah Pierman. I'm the CEO of Dynamic Boards. For those of you who I haven't met, thank you so much for joining us today. It is great to be with you to chat about the Women on Board stats, the non-FTSE version. So I've got lots of stats to talk through with you, but to start with, I'll just share kind of where this came from for me. I joined a charity board when I was 25 and I was the only woman. Then I joined a bank board at 29 and I was the only female director. Then I joined a home care provider, and there was one other female NED, and then a banking software company, and there was a female FD. So for me, whenever I saw the headlines that talked about this 40% women on boards, it never quite made sense to me. I thought, where were the boards with the thought 40%? But that was, I think, looking back, because I was on the board of private companies, not the FTSE, and those stats can be quite different. So I've always been curious about pulling together some of the stats around private companies, and there's a good reason why they look at the FTSE 350 and the top 50 largest companies in the UK. Part of that is because they've got massive systemic impact on society because of their scale. So that's fair play that you would look at those ones. But the other thing is, when you look at all the other organisations that have a huge impact, there's just far too many of them. There's hundreds and thousands of boards you'd have to analyse. So where do you start? So what I've done since is have a look at Dynamic Boards' stats, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. For me, helping the best possible mix of people make their way onto UK boards has always been so important, and it's a big part of the reason that I set up Dynamic Boards 6 years ago. So what have Dynamic Boards done to help women find their way onto boards? So we make a big point that Dynamic Boards is free for everyone of all genders to sign up and view roles. We advertise around 100 roles a month. We've listed over 7,000 since we launched 6 years ago, and lots and lots of women are gaining from being able to see our roles for free. We also run sessions that empower people with information about becoming board members. So we run Future NEDs sessions. We track our candidates as they sign up. They fill in a form and give us lots of data. That means we know that we have 48% of our candidates are women. We're really proud that we've got a really good mix of men and women coming through that system. When people get on a board, we support them with our NED community, and lots of women particularly appreciate that community and contribute lots to it as well. So how do we help the companies to find the female board members? Well, boards can list with us. The cost is lower compared to search, and the impact is very high. Because we've got so much data on our candidates, we can specifically target the groups that are underrepresented on their board. It's legal, it's ethical. What we're saying is everyone is welcome to apply. The role is advertised on our website. But what we are going to do is help make sure the people that are underrepresented on your board do hear about it. So we've done that just recently with an organisation who said they're looking for someone in tech. They know women are underrepresented on their board, and they came to us and said, look, can you get the word out to the women? So we could send a targeted email to make sure the women in tech on our database heard about the role. That targeted approach, that using data is what we're all about, and we've been tracking data ever since we started Dynamic Boards 6 years ago. Now, one of the data points we've been tracking is what do boards say in the adverts that they list with us? And we've been tracking phrases like, I particularly welcome women to apply. Organisations list these kind of diversity statements differently in how they write adverts. But what we've tracked is whether they mention anything about encouraging people from different groups, but different backgrounds, different diversity characteristics to apply. But we've also tracked whether they specifically mention gender or women. Tracking that over time, we've seen that the percentage of boards that do mention encouraging women to apply has been steadily dropping since we started. What's interesting is if you see the next graph here, in the same context, it's been dropping whilst those boards have been mentioning diversity. They are trying to encourage a better mix of people onto their boards. They're just not specifically calling out women. Now back to the big stats. What percentage of boards are women? On the FTSE 350, it's 43% women on boards now. That doesn't mean all the boards are 43%, but that's the overall average. On the largest 50 private companies, it's 30%. Now, Dynamic Boards' last 50, we call them public organisations. They're actually NHS, trusts, housing associations, public sector bodies. Overall, that's 45%. So that's actually the best stat in this group. And lastly, on our private company listings, so the last 50 private companies that we've listed on Dynamic Boards, 31% of their boards are women on average. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you look at our NHS trusts, housing associations, public sector, that is the most likely place where you will find women on the boards. 45% of the boards are women there on average. So it's still not 51%, it's still not representative of society, but it is much more significant than you're going to get in other organisations. FTSE's creeping up, it's nearly at the same level. But private companies, whether they're the largest 50 or our most recent 50, which are definitely smaller than that largest 50, and we've made sure they don't cross over at all there, then that you're seeing a significant drop. So it's around 30% of the boards are women. On many boards, looking at those private companies, say there's 7 people on the board, that means 2 women will be there. This includes all roles, so this includes the executive, if they're on the board, and the non-executive and the chair. Now, the FTSE Women Leaders Review that pulls together these stats on the FTSE 350 and the largest 50 companies, they share a target of 40%, to have 40% women on boards. Now, the FTSE 350, if we look at this next slide, then you'll see the proportion of them, it's nearly 70% of them are at or above that 40% target. Whereas when you look at private companies, whether they're the largest or the last 50 that Dynamic Boards have listed, you'll see that comes way down, and it's 30 to 35% of those boards that are over 40% women. If you look at our last 50 public organisations, that's our NHS trusts, housing associations, public sector bodies, they are much higher, very akin to the FTSE 350, and they have around 70% of their boards have at least 40% women. Now, I'm not so focused on the executive side of things, but while we were gathering the data, we thought it was worth touching on the data around CEO representation to see if that carried a similar story. Now, in that FTSE Women Leaders Review, they do touch on the FTSE 350 and the largest 50 private companies stats for female CEOs. So you can see the stats on this graph here. So with the FTSE 350, it is desperately low, that percentage of female CEOs, but it's actually not that much better anywhere else. So the largest 50 private companies, even our last 50 public organisations, or our last 50 private companies, none of them have anything over 25% as an average percentage of women taking on those CEO roles. So it's clear that women are desperately underrepresented at a CEO level right across the board. What about the chairs of the board? So we've looked at the FTSE 350 stats and we've got our own here too. And what you'll see from this graph is that public organisations do have a better representation, nearly 50-50 of chairs on boards. So they've got a nearly 50-50 mix of female and male. But when you look at the private companies, it's very similar to the largest private and to these most recent private that we've done. It's just under 30%, between that 20 and 30%. Likewise with the FTSE, it's very poor. It's under 20% of the board chairs are women. So female representation at chair level is low across the board, other than with those NHS trusts, housing associations, public sector bodies, where they do seem to have a much better mix. So let's bring that to life by looking at some pictures of the boards. So here is the board of the North London NHS Foundation Trust. You'll see they've got a female chair and a female chief exec, and a really good mix of women and men across the rest of the board as well. Here you see the board of a private company called Mutual Energy, one of the ones in that 50 that we pulled the data for. And so they've got a male chair, a male chief exec. They've got 2 women on the board in non-exec roles. And this does give you a flavour of the kinds of boards we're talking about when we're saying that they have that underrepresentation in CEO and underrepresentation in chair. Sometimes it's helpful to see a picture to get a sense of how different these boards are that we're talking about. So those NHS Foundation trusts that are so reflective of their communities, of their demographics, of the 51% of women that they serve, and then private companies where they tend to have far lower representation of women, particularly in those key roles of chair and CEO. Now, I know you'll all be buzzing about these stats, and with lots of creative ideas for things that could make these stats change. So we're going to invite you to jump into breakout rooms. We've got 4 breakout room hosts, and they're from our NED Community members. So thank you to Liz, Louise, John and Ruth. So we're going to have a chat about these 3 questions. What's holding women back from becoming NEDs, chairs and CEOs? What would it take to see this change in the next 1 to 5 years? And if you were advising a chair who had low female representation on their board, what would you say? You've got 15 minutes, and we'll jump back together and hear feedback from the four chairs. Okay, I think we've got everyone. So we're going to go around. We had four chairs. Ruth, I'll come to you first if that's okay.
We looked at the first question, and that kind of leads to other discussions, which is, what's stopping women from reaching these roles. And some of the points that were raised were around, how men and women approach applying for roles. So there was conversation around, men would kind of look at a role and I think if they meet 35% of the requirement, they'll apply for it, while women would want to tick all of the boxes. But some people in the group did say that they necessarily don't do that because they feel that if they do not meet all of the requirements, then they're wasting their time applying for the role, because, they wouldn't progress onto the next stage. There was also a conversation around how men and women approach things, and it wasn't it's generalistic, but there was conversation around, men are loud and they've, talk about their achievements and their bossy, etc. But women tend to approach things quite differently. And sometimes you might have to do that to get onto to these roles, but that's also uncomfortable if that's not in your personality. There was also a discussion around representation. If you look at the board and you don't see yourself represented, that might discourage you from actually thinking, I want to apply for the role. And there was a suggestion around, and I think this goes into, what would it take to see change? Suggestion around we need more male allies on the board that recognize that this is an issue and will do their best to go out there and encourage more women and make it a welcoming environment for women to join in to thrive. And there was a discussion we were having until we got pulled back in around,
Sorry.
the job descriptions being more welcoming, the language that's used in that job description, and the way it's written. If it's written in quite a masculine way, that might be off-putting to women applying. And we didn't quite unpack that. I would have liked to unpack that a bit more, as in what does a good welcoming job description looks like? What does a masculine job description look like? We didn't quite get to unpacking that, but those were some of the points and things that we discussed.
Thank you so much for sharing the group, Ruth. I've noted down some of your thoughts there, and it's things that we've definitely heard about before. One thing we'll often say whenever people are looking at NED roles is often the person who gets the role is someone who didn't actually meet that brief. So if you don't beat that brief, don't miss out on that opportunity, because quite often boards hire slightly different to their spec, because they realise that person would bring value, and often they haven't spent quite enough time thinking through that spec. So totally agree with those points from your group. Right, we'll come to Liz.
We had Alexander on our board. I hope it's right to call you out because she is involved in drawing up shortlists to get people onto boards and sort of talked about how it's really important to make sure you have got that strong shortlist so you're not just relying on, oh, I know somebody and I'll bring that person in. So it's fine to have that person on the shortlist, but also to bring in a really strong other diverse list of candidates. So the whole way you structure your recruitment process is really important because otherwise it can just be the person that you think you'd get on well with in the pub, which is, kind of can be it's very easy to feel confident about recruiting in your own likeness and think, oh, I recognize that and whatever. We talked about having courses that people can actually help women to get more confident so that whether the barrier is real or perceived, that they get themselves into that space. We also talked about the difficulty of not knowing what's out there, especially if it's not what you've worked in, then how do you know what's out there? So opening up those things. There's a shout out for, dynamic boards, having that free access point so that people can get in there. Yeah, but there was a feeling that it is hard. It can be really hard to break in. Once you've broken in, it's much easier because you're in that space. But getting over that hump is really difficult. Um, and if for example, private equity is already quite male dominated, then that makes it even harder to get through and see your way into that. Um, some of the solutions, we got a bit onto solutions. One person said they'd worked with female only shortlists, which we were told are legal, and that had transformed somebody's opinion and said, oh, that's fantastic. We could have appointed all five of them. So some of the structural things around recruitment um, as well, and just being more transparent, having some women only spaces where women can talk about their experiences, perhaps share, success stories, but just and also the things that they found difficult. So those kind of things were the main things we came up with, trying to counter, make the process more neutral rather than its tendency towards what they've always done.
Yeah.
And you have to be a bit proactive and a bit intentional about that.
Thank you, Liz, for sharing your group's feedback. Ruth earlier mentioned about we need more male allies, and I would say John is certainly one of them. So, John, please share thoughts from your group.
Thank you. And I think it's worth reflecting on this conversation from a man's perspective, that actually it's not the people who are the problem, it's the systems that are the problems. There are some fantastic people out there. I've met women either on board journeys or in executive roles who are way better than me, far, far better, but actually are not getting sight or opportunity or access to many of the networks and the board opportunities that they really do deserve to be in the running for, and then actually being heard and recognised for the talents and differences that they bring onto boards, rather than, oh, bit too different, bit unknown, probably not going to be a good fit on an all-male board. Therefore, let's go for the white guy again. The first two groups have covered an awful lot, so I won't necessarily duplicate in that respect. But a big one that came out on question one for us was just the imposter syndrome. And it's and again, it's, I don't know whether women are harder on themselves personally than men, or whether it's men just being better bluffers and having larger egos. But you know, no, there's no such thing as a perfect candidate. And as Sarah's already alluded to, during the recruiting process, board requirements often change or they evolve. So you've got to be in it. If you're discounting yourself, you're not in the race. At least if you're anybody who applies for a non-exec role, it's a bit of a numbers game to begin with. But if you're getting through long list onto short list and then short list into interview, it's all progress, even though it might seem slow at sometimes. The time availability was another factor that came out. With women often being primary carers, whether it be for children or for elderly parents, it's flexing the norms of, sort of traditional Monday, Friday, 9 to 5 board meetings, and actually how many of those board meetings can be adapted to be more accommodating, to give people greater accessibility, so that they can manage, they can manage time better rather than be pigeonholed to almost an industrial era way of working. 9 to 5, Monday to Friday must be in person. And I know you've often discussed, you've often mentioned your experience to me in that respect, Sarah. We've touched a bit about um, networks, but actually being in networks, and I do see a little bit of similarity between some of the allyship support I give to Black and Asian networks within women's networks, in that um, it's understanding the rules of often the rules of the game, who were designed by people like me, written by people like me, and actually the selections made people like me. So um, it's my duty. I feel that it's my duty to be able to open up some of those networks, drop down ladders, and help support people into positions. But you've got to go and find out. Sometimes go and find those people who are maybe very different to you, who can offer different views, who can offer different types of support. On question 2, we touched around better succession planning, better access into opportunities. NHS boards for me have always been a really great one. If you're relatively new in your non-exec career and you want to understand how many public boards work in particular, NHS trusts have open board meetings. It's certainly one of the first things I engaged with at the very stage of my NED education with the Institute of Directors. Board apprenticeships. If you are in an organisation that is really serious about capturing its talent across a very diverse spectrum, and I'm not just talking about protected characteristics here, I'm talking about the whole differences that actually great boards recognise in combination of creating better decisions, is if it doesn't exist, suggest bringing people in for board observations, maybe bringing in a small board apprenticeship scheme. Really good thing for charities, for example, to maybe open up and get people applying who wouldn't necessarily otherwise apply for the roles. Invite them to see how the organisation operates within. Commercially, there may be a few restrictions or sort of NDA considerations to put in place, but it's not unmanageable. And then on the third question, very much looking at the balance of training within sort of middle, senior management and board level on the technical training, but also the skills competency. That crossover into the boardroom is a different one. In the same way that a lot of board members are male because they've had good executive careers, and so they're seen as a low risk continuing from executive careers into non-executive careers, for example. The mindsets and behaviours are very different. Too many men, and particularly white men who have had traditional executive careers, want to exercise that same level of control in the boardroom, forgetting that everybody around the board table shares joint and several responsibility by law, and actually they are equally responsible for the success of the organisation. So from a purely legal perspective, there is no hierarchy in the boardroom. It's just those hierarchies can often be dominated by not even stronger personalities, I would say louder personalities. I think we touched on the point about shortlist diversity. Again, it's been touched on by one of the other groups, but not necessarily touching on to positive discrimination. There are pros and cons both legally and ethically around that, in my view, but also making sure that the shortlist is representative of the organisation, whether it be customers, whether it be stakeholders, whether it be shareholders. But we're not just comparing like for like with people who look like me and are called John, but actually we've got a broad range of diversity, different people, different knowledge, skills, experience and behaviours that a nominations committee can look at and make a balanced assessment on whether they are the best individual individually, but also whether they're the best individual to add value in combination through the board as a joint entity. And then final piece for me, and I know it happens in dynamic boards already, but actually those referral networks. We all see, I suspect, opportunities that might not be the right ones for us, but actually, if they're not right ones for us, who do we know? And actually, who do we know? Which great women in my community do I know who that role might be an absolute sweet spot role for, when it actually might not be something that's a great fit for me, or something that I'm maybe not interested in because it doesn't align with my own personal values. So do pay it forward. I often think that the journey into boardrooms is better done together, so everybody wins. rather than trying to compete it alone.
Thank you, John. Louise Wilson, over to you.
Super, thank you. So I was inspired by my group, and I want to do this every Monday at 12 noon so that I can build my week into a really positive week. So honestly, I won't. People always say this when they go last. The majority has been covered, but what I'll do is just reference the things that I think were specific that we'd want to amplify from the previous group. So first of all, a reminder, I guess, from us that it's the responsibility of the board, the organisations, and those applying. No one area is going to fix and solve this over the next 5 years. So we also talked about how we can help women to apply, building confidence with mentoring and coaching, but it's a push and a pull that women need to push themselves forward and have that confidence to apply, and organisations need to be open and welcoming to women applying. There was a question really, which is, where is the real issue? So where is it that women are not applying? Are they applying and not getting shortlisted? Are they then not being successful? Are they withdrawing because of what they're seeing? So some sort of research onto that, Sarah, for your next project would be gratefully appreciated. Thank you. We talked about whether the roles in private companies are actually visible. Obviously, FTSE public sector have these targets, and so therefore they kind of have to. So how are people seeing the roles? And then a big conversation about pipelining. So how can we get women into leadership roles? So appreciate John's point, the difference between an exec and a non-exec is different. But I think 9 times out of 10, probably NEDs are coming from executive roles. And so therefore, how can we ensure that we're helping organisations when we're in board and committee roles to be questioning their pipelining too, and looking at their talent management processes as well? So for all the REMCOs and people committees that I'm on, that's a big piece for us, is the diversity starting at grassroots level. We had a great example of somebody who has seen an organisation who is saying they're leaving application windows open for longer, so for a month, and seeing more women apply. Yes, Sarah, your little head there, absolutely. So in terms of just saying people needing more time, either to go through that process of building their confidence to apply, or physically having the time to apply because they are superheroes and are busy juggling so many things, not sure what's driving that. And a great example of one of our group who's been doing some personal branding with female NEDs. And that was another common theme that I think the other groups had, around people really being clear on what do they stand for, why are they applying, how are they applying, who are they going to pull on when they are applying. So really being clear on their USP as a non-exec director, and balancing as well those sort of hormone challenges for women, for recognising that within any month or within any 12-month period, there are differences for women during that time, and therefore maybe having more time or being clearer on the pre-work and having that personal branding really helps, I guess, when the hormones are at a dipping point. We talked about allyship. We were very grateful to see John on the call, but deeply disappointed to see John looked like probably the only male on the call, not making judgment by appearance, but I think that was probably the case, and so we thought that was a bit of a shame. But we were talking about allyship, male allyship. We had a great example of a male who had been pushing the menopause policy within their organisation, what a fantastic example. And then for chairs advice, we just said that we need to help chairs to recognise what they're missing. We need to be selling that structured recruitment process for chairs. We need to be explaining that it needs to be deliberate. It won't just happen by working the network. And we have to have those voices, those of us who are on boards already or in that opportunity to influence chair thinking, was just one of the things we talked about from a chair perspective.
Thank you, Louise. That was absolutely brilliant. That's fascinating to hear all of that feedback. And what we will do is we'll pull together all of the insights that you've all shared and try and pull together a bit of a blog with some of these ideas, some of these thoughts, and share some of this video as well. Just one question, if anyone wants to jump in, we've got a couple of minutes left, but specifically on chair representation, what do you think are the biggest challenges for getting women chairs, and how do we encourage more? Christine?
Yeah, well, actually, I am a woman chair, so I walk the talk. If I may, Sarah, I wanted to make 2 observations. As a chair, I'm always very keen to get the best talent regardless of gender, ethnicity, or whatever, around my board table. So that's always my approach, because I feel at the end of the day, as a board, you have obligations to the company. I chair a private sector company. You have obligations to the company, so that you, first and foremost, your board needs to be there to deliver for the company. But one of the things that came up, which I really want to give a shout out to, is the whole idea of giving people the opportunity to shadow board positions, or mentorships and or apprenticeships and that sort of thing. Because as a board chair, I do not have the time to really bring on people, once we're hitting the ground running, and we're a very dynamic, quite demanding company. But I love the idea of people having the opportunity to get some training, and then also to decide for themselves whether coming on a board is the right thing for them or not. So I don't know whether there's much out there at the moment around these type of schemes, but for me that is possibly one area where there is a lot of opportunity.
Thank you, Christine. Yes, there are a couple of schemes out there, but I'd love to chat to you further and see whether we can help, because we obviously have lots of candidates who'd be interested in that kind of opportunity and would love to develop themselves. I think you're right, like looking at, okay, how do we do it in a way that actually suits where boards are at and the capacity they have, which is quite key. And I think legally what you've just described, Christine, is the only correct way to do it. So when you say the phrase of keen to get the best person regardless of gender, you cannot put preference based on gender when it comes to appointing. You can make sure you get the word out to a good mix of people, but when it comes to actually appointing an individual, you can't go for them because of their gender. So we'll definitely do a session on the legalities of that, because I'm sure there's lots of people who are confused, but you're very clear and that is exactly right. But I think you're right, shadow boards, apprenticeships, associate non-exec roles like that. I think that's a great way to go.
I can also add to that maybe. So I'm a chair of a UK registered charity that actually works internationally. And what has been very interesting, I mean, we very rarely meet actually physically because we're all over the world. And I think that there's such a lot of difficulty in understanding the role of a chair, particularly of a charity. I was an initial trustee, and then I was voted as chair, and trying to do quite a lot of reform of the actual board, and put in better governance at the moment, which has been a very interesting learning process for me, let alone for the others. And working across geographies as well is really interesting. And I find that experience quite difficult to fit into the UK perspective, and yet I think there's a lot of richness and added value in that. And that might be something else to also consider, because women they don't necessarily have the right qualifications, and they don't necessarily have the right career pathway to respond to certain adverts. But I think that they've got a lot to bring, and a lot to bring in added value to that. And maybe there's something in there to work on.
Thank you, Heather. That's a great insight. I appreciate that. And definitely that international board piece is a totally different perspective, and mainly doing online meetings is also very different in terms of building relationships and how you manage that. Brilliant. We will close there. Thank you all so much for joining. It's a lot of work gathering the data, and so we'll be sharing that through LinkedIn and social media after today. But I hope you have found encouragement as well as challenge through this session, and I hope hearing each other's ideas makes you realise the richness of the journey that we have ahead of us as we try and improve the representation of women on UK boards. If any of you think Dynamic Boards can support you in any way through what you're going through, we'd love you to reach out to us. We obviously advertise roles, but we also are looking to really champion a best possible mix of people to find their way onto UK boards. So any ideas and thoughts are really welcome. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.